Hello, this workshop is about metacognition, which is one of the most important strategies that a student can implement to use their study time most effectively. I'm going to move quickly through this recording. You can pause it if you want to take notes, and if you want to learn more, the last slide has information about how to follow our center and how to contact me with any questions. My name is Tara Lassard, and I am the Learning and Career Specialist at the Washington State University Health Sciences campus in Spokane, Washington. I'm part of the Student Success Center, where we offer a number of different services, including counseling, writing help, and learning support and career preparation for students who attend classes on our campus. What we're going to talk about today is metacognition. What is it? How can it be helpful to you? And how do you implement some of these metacognitive learning strategies to be a more effective student? Real quickly, I want to talk about the types of learning services that are available to you as a WSU Spokane student. You can meet with me one-on-one or as part of a study group. You can bring me into a study group or a classroom environment. I can do in-person appointments, or we can meet by Skype or by phone. I can work with you on developing individualized learning strategies that work for you. We ask a lot of questions in our sessions about what you've tried before, what's worked and what hasn't, what type of material you're trying to learn, and drill down into a study plan that is individualized. The first thing that's important to understand about metacognition is to understand how we learn information and how we create a higher level of understanding. And the best way to explain that is by using Bloom's taxonomy. Benjamin Bloom was an early educational theorist who came up with these levels of understanding, starting with remembering and working your way up to creating. At each level, let's see if I can, here we go. At each level, the verbs that you'll notice in each one of these boxes becomes more complex. So at the first level, remembering, all you're doing is defining information. But as you work up, you're starting to compare and contrast. You're starting to apply to particular situations. You're starting to make connections among differing ideas, or get to a position where you're able to argue or articulate a position on a topic. So you can see how these build upon one another. What we find is that students are usually able to earn A grades at the remembering level when they're in high school. And then they make a transition to college, and the expectation is that they can apply information at the understanding and applying levels. But that isn't, the leap from remembering to understanding and applying, how to get there, isn't always clearly defined for students. And so we sort of come up with different learning strategies and we implement them, and most students are able to be successful in making that leap. Metacognition or metacognitive strategies are a way to help students make that leap from one level to the next level. So we're going to get into specific metacognitive strategies, but what I want you to pay attention to in Bloom's taxonomy are the verbs at each one of these levels, because if you're creating good quality questions for yourself, for example, on practice tests or flashcards, those questions should not only have words like define or list or memorize, but they should also have words like differentiate, relate, compare, and contrast, which you see at the analyzing level. When you're in your junior and senior year, we would expect you to be able to operate in applying and some analyzing. When you get up to graduate or professional school, we really do expect you to be up in analyzing and evaluating. Creating is the PhD level, where you're actually creating new knowledge. So this is just a brief swath of what Bloom's taxonomy is about, just to give you some foundation for what the purpose is of metacognition and what you're trying to do as you apply those strategies. So what is metacognition? Meta means about or many, and cognition is thinking. So metacognition is thinking about how you're thinking. How do you do that? This is sort of a cerebral concept. Basically, it's asking yourself questions that begin with words like why, how, what if, how does this relate to something else? You can see from the image here that there's a number of different thought bubbles. What do I already know about this topic? How does this relate to something that I've learned before or something that I've learned in another class? How does this relate to a story or an experience that I've had in my own life? So you're asking yourself good quality questions that are really forcing you to think at a deeper level about some sort of concept or idea rather than just simply memorizing. There are many metacognitive learning strategies out there, and I'm going to cover just 4 of them today. If you'd like more, I'd encourage you to come and visit with me or check out some of the resources that I list on the references slide. The 4 I'm going to go over today are active reading, dual coding, which is comparing images and words, elaboration, which is questioning techniques, and then retrieval practice, which is sort of your highest level of metacognitive learning strategy. So some metacognitive strategies are about planning, some are about the active learning, and some are about finalizing or verifying that you actually know the information. That retrieval practice is verifying that the learning you did was effective and that you can retrieve this information. So that's often best saved for last. Active reading is a strategy that's been around for quite some time, often referred to as PQ3R. And what does that mean? It means preview, question, read, recite, review. Let's break this down. Previewing is basically just flipping through headings, looking at definitions, images, or graphs. If you're looking at a slideshow instead of a textbook, this still works. You can just flip through the whole slideshow, one slide at a time, just looking at each slide for a few seconds, and you're looking for the same stuff: headings, diagrams, images, summaries. If you're looking through a textbook or an article, same thing, flipping through. If there's no images, no bold-faced words, which we often see in peer-reviewed journal articles, you can just read the first sentence of each paragraph as you skim through. The goal here is just to create a basic foundation for what you are about to learn. The reason that you need that basic foundation, there's 2 reasons. The first one is because we learn new information by attaching it to things we already know. So by creating that basic foundation, you're creating something to attach your learning to as you dig in deeper. The second reason is that you want to be able to ask meaningful questions for yourself about what you're about to learn. That's where metacognition's coming in, is that you're asking yourself questions about why, how, what if, why is it important for me to learn this? How does this relate to other material? So in order to ask those questions, you need to at least preview. So that's the preview. The questioning I just went over. You can take a few minutes to write down your questions, or you can just articulate them out loud, whatever works best for you, as long as you can remember what you asked. Some programs will offer learning objectives or study guides in advance, and that can be helpful for you in deciding what sort of questions you want to ask as you're engaging in the material. What I would advise you to be careful of is using those learning objectives or study guides as your only guide, because then what we find you're doing is you're really just searching for answers as you're reading the material instead of really actively engaging in it through questions that you wrote that were meaningful to you. Read, recite, review. So read, recite is really just paraphrasing. What you're doing is you're reading through a section of the material and then you're rewriting in your own words what you just learned. And this gets a little tricky because often what people will do is they'll read a page, let's say, or 2 or 3 slides, and then they'll go to paraphrase what they read, but they didn't quite remember all of it, so they'll look back at the material for reference, and then they'll write down what the material is saying. And what happens when you do that is you're really just passing the material from the learning resource to your notebook, and it's not actively you're not actively engaging in it, it's not moving through your mind, you're not necessarily learning it. So what I would advise you to do when you go to paraphrase, and this is a really important metacognitive strategy, is that you go to write down what you just learned, and if you can't remember, that you pause and you give yourself more time to try and recall what it was you were just reading and what you gathered from that before you look back at the material for reference. Most of the time when you give yourself just a little pause, you will come up with something that you read. If you don't, if you do come to an impasse and you can't remember, then I would advise you to do some research out on the webs. Find good sources and learn more about this topic that you're learning about, and then look back at the material that you are reading and paraphrase it on the piece of paper or Word document that you're using. What's happening there is you're engaging in an investigatory process, and we do learn from investigation. So if you just turn back to the material as reference and write it down, you're not learning as well as if you were to go out and find more information about it and then write it into your own words, and then continue with your reading. And students will chunk this down. It just depends on how heavy the material is and how well you're focusing that particular day or that particular time. You might do one page at a time. It might be one paragraph, or it might be one slide. It might be 10 slides. That's something that you have to gauge. And then review, the last step in the PQ3R, is going over all of the material that you paraphrased, comparing it with the materials that you read. What did you miss? What do you want to draw out, perhaps, or document in a different way? Maybe you want to star some things that you would like to focus on later. And then the last thing with review is you want to look back at the questions that you wrote and make sure that you answered all of those questions. If you missed anything, dig back into the material. If you can't find answers to those questions, then you've already got something great to bring with you to class to ask your professor or your peers. This is PQ3R, which is a way to structure active reading. So this is the first of the 4 metacognitive strategies. The next one is dual coding. Dual coding is about comparing images and words. The best way to do this is to look at material that you're trying to learn that has images attached to it and compare the images and the words. And then look at just the visuals and remove the words or cover them up and explain in your own words by just looking at that visual what it is that you're learning. And then you do the opposite. So then you just cover up the words and you recreate the image that goes along with those words. And what you're trying to work up to is being able to create the images and the words to create both of them purely from memory. So in the beginning, you might have to look back at your materials a little bit or do some internet research to be able to recreate that image or to be able to recreate that text when all you have is the image. But what you're working yourself up to is recreating the whole shebang independently from what you've learned. Some people will get creative with this strategy, and instead of recreating the image that's been provided to them in their learning resources, they will create their own image. As you can see on the slide, there's an infographic here. The graphic organizers, otherwise known as a mind map. You can do a timeline if that makes sense for you, cartoon strips, diagrams. So there's lots of different ways and creative ways to recreate images. But this is a really good strategy for also doing some retrieval practice because you're removing part of what you're learning and seeing if you can retrieve it. That was the second of the 4 strategies. This is the third, elaboration, which we've really already discussed. It's about asking yourself good questions that start with why, how, what if, and then discussing them with your classmates. So you're creating a deeper understanding, a bigger understanding by sharing what you learned and then learning what your classmates also learned about this topic. As you are talking about it, or if you're working in a group, you might do this out loud. If you're working solo, you might do this on a piece of paper or on a whiteboard, but you start to draw out connections between different ideas. What you see on the slide here is a mind map. And you're comparing how 2 concepts or processes are similar or different. You might also relate to how something has played out in a similar way in your life before. But what you're trying to work your way up to is being able to explain this concept or topic completely without having to reference your course materials. The last of the metacognitive strategies that I'm going to go over in this workshop is the most important one, really, but it's the last one. So this is when you're verifying that you have really learned what you set out to learn, and it's called retrieval practice. Most of us have done some sort of retrieval practice before. The number one strategy in retrieval practice that will increase test scores is practice testing. Practice testing has been shown to increase test scores by about 10%, and that's higher than any other learning strategy that's been studied. So what do you do if your program does not have a practice test? What you can do as a group is you can get together with a group of students and each decide how many questions you're going to write independently. So maybe everybody writes 10 or 20 questions, and then you all exchange your questions. And what you'll find is that different people are focusing on different concepts and topics. So it double checks you to make sure that you're actually covering what you need to, or learning all of the concepts that you need to. What's really important with devising questions for a practice test is that you're using words or verbs in your questions that match up with the level of Bloom's taxonomy that you need to be at. It might be useful for you to print out that slide that we went over earlier, the Bloom's taxonomy slide, and be sure that your practice test questions are using those verbs. Now remember that the Bloom's taxonomy, the ideas build upon one another, so you will need to have some questions that are at the remembering level and at the understanding level, but you're going to want to continue to work your way up all the way to the evaluating. So make sure your questions are a swath of all of those areas, covering all of those areas. Another way to do retrieval practice, aside from practice tests, is flashcards. It's the same thing. Make sure you're using verbs at all of the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy, so you're really deepening that understanding. But the key with flashcards is that you write out those meaningful questions, but when you go to practice to read the flashcard, you don't actually flip it over until you have articulated out loud the answer, or at least articulated it fully in your head. What I see a lot of students doing is they look at the card, they read the question, and they flip it over, and they look at the answer, and they verify, yes, that's the correct answer. And what you're doing here is not really retrieval practice, it's recognition practice. So you are practicing that you can recognize the right answer, which is very different from retrieving the answer out of your memory storage. So be sure that you're retrieving, because that's how you'll be tested, and that's what you're going to need to know when you get out into the world as a practitioner. Okay, this last slide is really just about making a commitment. From what I've learned, if students don't implement a new strategy within 48 hours, they are very unlikely to ever implement that new strategy. So I would encourage you to take what you've learned today and pick at least one of the strategies we've talked about: active reading, or the PQ3R method; dual coding, which is comparing images and words and then challenging yourself by removing one or the other; elaboration, which is questioning, asking good questions and then explaining it out loud, collaborating with your peers on that; and then retrieval practice. Practice testing, flashcards are great examples of retrieval practice. So pick one at least and try it out, and then if you want to dig deeper, if it's sort of working for you but not as well as you had hoped, come in and see me, and we can talk about designing a more customized learning strategy for you. On the current slide, you can see where to book an appointment with me. You have to set up an account the first time, but after that, it's really easy to get in, see when I'm available, and reserve some time. You can also email me with any questions or call me with any questions that you have. If you follow us on Facebook, we do send out about once a week some kind of learning tip or information about workshops that are coming up on our campus. Thank you for watching today.